In 1913, the British government was under assault. Its own people were torching buildings, shattering office windows, and attacking the homes of government leaders. These revolutionaries were not Irish nationalists, nor striking laborers. They were frustrated British women, furious that their government refused to take them seriously. Their goal was simple: suffrage, the right to vote.
They want to be full citizens. I mean, the narrowest definition of citizens is people who can vote.
But in Victorian England, their request was dismissed as too outrageous to be taken seriously.
If a woman had the vote equal with men, that meant sexual equality. And that could then challenge the whole structure of the family, and you would have social chaos.
The press labeled these militant women suffragettes. They were led by the fiery Emmeline Pankhurst and her two strong-willed and very different daughters, Christabel and Sylvia.
If you could describe all three of the Pankhurst women, the term iron-willed is what comes to mind first.
The Pankhursts contributed to an atmosphere of turmoil, excitement, and change in late Victorian England. They helped fashion a movement that forever altered the political landscape and the perception of women. But in the process, each of them paid a heavy personal price. From an early age, Emmeline Goulden had been attracted to radical political causes. In 1879, she married Richard Pankhurst, a fellow liberal reformer. Theirs was a marriage based on mutual love and a passionate desire to improve society. For 19 years, the Pankhursts created a home, raised a family, and remained active in radical political circles. Richard was a socialist, and both he and Emmeline were committed to fighting against the injustice of England's rigid class system. Like most Western European countries, in England, written and unwritten rules governed the relationships between the aristocracy, the middle and working classes, and the poor.
Class is one of the central social categories in British society, certainly. The way in this country it might be race. In Britain, it is class.
The class system has a profound effect on all politics in Great Britain. So, for instance, one key point is that the vote is always tied to property owning.
But that restriction gradually eroded as England's industries grew in size and importance. Soon the government, recognizing the economic clout of the expanding middle class, moved to extend the vote. Over the next 50 years, the voting franchise grew to include middle and later working-class men. And by 1884, all men, including laborers, had been granted the right to vote. But not women.
A lot of people argue that women are too emotional. They're too emotional to vote, and they're too emotional to put aside their personal feelings. They would only vote for what's best for their family. They would never vote for sort of the greater national good.
With the line between who could and couldn't vote drawn solely based on sex rather than class, women pressed the government for change.
A lot of middle and upper class women are horrified that men who are lower down the social system than them can vote. That's very offensive to them.
In response to universal suffrage for men, hundreds of women, including the young Emmeline Pankhurst, joined grassroots organizations committed to getting women the vote. And in 1897, they created a coalition, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, the NUWSS.
The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies make their political demands through constitutional means.
Their tactics were to write letters, to petition, to give speeches, usually just to women audiences, but to try in very ladylike ways to get the right to vote, to ask members of Parliament, please, can we have the right to vote?
They are behaving in such a way that doesn't call attention to themselves. And in large part, they have no attention in consequence of that. And politicians in Parliament can claim there's no political support for your demand. And so why in God's name would we ever feel the need to grant you the vote?
Reformers had hopes that they could build support for women's rights through the newly formed Labour Party, and Emmeline and Richard Pankhurst were passionate supporters of this new organization. Richard himself ran for Parliament as a Labour Party candidate. But Emmeline's world was torn apart when at the age of 62, Richard Pankhurst died suddenly. Devastated, Emmeline, aided by two of her now grown daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, devoted herself to the causes that she and her husband had championed.
In fact, the Labour Party in Manchester raises funds to build a hall that they name after Richard Pankhurst. When Christabel and Sylvia and Emmeline go there to be a part of the opening of it, they find very early on that they are not admitted to it because they are women.
Embarrassed and enraged, Emmeline understood firsthand that without a man as head of her house, she and her daughters were now publicly invisible. Like most Victorian women, she was not expected to play any role outside her home.
There was a saying, the man and the wife are one, and that one is the man. And often what would happen would be that a woman would go from living in her father's household to go and then live in her husband's household. So there was always a man who legally looked after her and who represented her out in the world.
For the first time now, motherhood becomes a profession. Well, now, women have always mothered from I think the time of Eve, but now you start seeing it as a woman's job. All this makes up what is known as the sort of cult of domesticity, that a woman's place is in the home, the idea of two worlds. The man's world is the public outside world of work, world of achievement, of competition. The woman's world is the domestic world.
Emmeline and her daughters rejected the idea that women should have no role outside the home. They advocated that women stake a claim to their rights as citizens. But Emmeline questioned the polite tactics of the National Union. So in 1903, with her daughters by her side, Emmeline founded a more radical group, the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU.
Emmeline Pankhurst looks at the suffrage movement and she says, well, you women are going nowhere. You're polite and you're decorous and nothing is ever going to happen. And she really believed that history did not happen gradually. History happened in bursts of greatness. And she wanted to make sure that she created those bursts of greatness. And that's why she founded the WSPU.
And their motto was deeds, not words. They said, we're tired of being ladylike, we're tired of asking for the right to vote. Their organization was radical also because it was women only. They came to argue that only women can work for their own cause.
Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst declared that in fact the fight for the vote is actually a sex war, that it is men against women.
The Pankhursts felt that in order to put pressure on the government, the suffrage movement sorely needed to attract the public's attention. So they helped the National Union organize marches and demonstrations.
The Pankhursts were able to organize huge demonstrations. The first was called the Mud March because of the weather and the conditions in which this group of 3,000 women in their best dresses and their largest hats would march on Parliament.
They were masters of this. I mean, thousands of people would see these parades, and these parades were made up of people from all kinds of occupations and all classes.
Suffrage pervades public spaces. There are suffrage billboards, suffrage posters. Lots of suffrage women wear jewelry or accessories that indicate their support, to just the way today people might wear a ribbon or a brooch or a bracelet that indicated some kind of political affiliation that they had. Similarly, lots of women are wearing the colors, for instance, of the WSPU.
They were political now. Their appearance in the streets was something, at least in the early 20th century, that many people would never have seen before.
Although the WSPU was beginning to have an impact on the general public, the British government remained unmoved and refused to take the issue of women's suffrage seriously. The Pankhursts' frustration growing, in 1905 they adopted more aggressive and confrontational tactics. Christabel and another suffragette disrupted a Liberal Party meeting where Winston Churchill was speaking. When asked to leave, they refused.
They demand to know whether they will support a women's suffrage measure, and then they are picked up bodily by a police officer and thrown out into the street. Christabel Pankhurst spits at a policeman and does so in order to get arrested and to bring attention to the movement.
They had started attending the House of Commons in the British Parliament and carry under their clothes banners and then sit up in the Strangers Gallery and then drop the banner, "Votes for Women."
What really marks militant suffragette action is that it is performative. It is spectacular. They are making a statement in public. They are disrupting politics as usual.
This caused all kinds of sensational reporting all over Britain, and all of a sudden the newspapers are full of this. So it became apparent that if you do something that brings attention to the movement, then people start discussing women's suffrage.
Christabel Pankhurst was particularly effective at galvanizing the movement. In a rare recording, she spoke about the WSPU.
The militant suffragists who form the women's social and political unions are engaged in the attempt to win the parliamentary vote for the women of this country.
As a jibe and insult, reporters took to calling a WSPU member a suffragette.
Now, ordinarily, she would have been considered a suffragist, an individual who was demanding the suffrage, demanding the vote. Very early on, in consequence of this militant behavior that's garnering public attention, the term suffragette becomes to be applied to these women, and it's meant to be a term of abuse. But very much like the encompassing or embracing of the term queer to indicate a gay rights movement, the WSPU embraces that term of abuse.
From the outside, the three Pankhurst women appeared to be a united front, but in fact, their relationships were filled with long-simmering resentments.
Christabel Pankhurst is her mother's favorite daughter. She is the one who works most closely with her. She shares with her mother this incredible charisma. But I think that even people who love them both are also a little frightened of them both. One of their good friends described Christabel as beautiful and gracious and ruthless, a dictator without mercy.
Sylvia wants recognition in the WSPU by her sister and her mother, which she does not get. She's not regarded by either of them as one of those key players, certainly not a member of the leadership that they constitute.
Though Emmeline and Christabel had inspired tens of thousands of women to join the campaign for suffrage, the WSPU remained a relatively small organization. Only women who could devote themselves totally to the cause became members.
They compare themselves to a religion, they compare themselves to an army. One suffragette in her memoir said that the unwritten rule of the day was that we were completely devoted to the cause. Suffragettes usually spell cause with a capital C, the cause.
Despite the growing number of women involved in the fight and 7 years of demonstrations, the British government still appeared no closer to granting women the right to vote. And the press had lost interest in the Pankhursts and their familiar tactics. Suffrage was no longer news. So the Pankhursts adopted a more dramatic, destructive, and subversive strategy.
They cross a final line into really acts of violence where more and more frustrated, they intensified their actions. They began using arson. They never took life, only property.
You will have members of the WSPU setting fire to buildings, they will burn boathouses, they will ruin golf courses, putting acid on them. They throw acid and inky substances in mailboxes.
Many moderate, law-abiding suffragists were appalled by the behavior of the WSPU and strove to distance themselves from the Pankhursts.
The National Union publicly disavows militant behavior. It hadn't up to that point because it was gaining quite considerably from it. And public support for the WSPU begins to diminish considerably. And the government cannot be perceived to be giving in, allowing the militant, violent behavior to force them to act.
Pushed to the limit, the police instituted a regular policy of arresting and imprisoning members of the WSPU. And yet these suffragettes managed to turn this policy to their advantage.
One of the things that comes to be part of what real devoted WSPU women do is they get arrested. They want to look respectable when they do it. Emmeline had very high standards of propriety. She always made sure that everyone had to wear a hat and gloves whenever they gave speeches. But They also had to dress properly, even if they were going off to get arrested, to do something that would get them arrested.
Ironically, it was the government's treatment of these women that turned public sentiment once again in favor of the suffragettes.
These women were arrested and they were sent to jail in the criminal division of the prison rather than the political division. And so they began to go on hunger strikes, demanding that they be put in the political division and gain the kinds of privileges that political prisoners had.
And the WSPU did say you had to go on a hunger strike, but yet if you're a member of the WSPU and you're arrested, it's rather expected that you will go on a hunger strike.
Fearing that the death of a suffragette might lead to public backlash, the government began a program of forced feeding.
Forced feeding by any measure is an unpleasant affair, but in 1909 it had to have been particularly gruesome. There were apparently two ways of delivering food to the stomach of these women. One was by means of a nasal tube, but even worse, I think, was the use of a tube that was administered right through the mouth down into the stomach, and in some instances that tube didn't make it to the stomach. Some women received fluid into their lungs by virtue of this forced feeding. It became in the minds of the public who began to hear about this as symbolic of rape, in fact.
It makes the government look terrible. In fact, it makes the government look so terrible that eventually they change tactics. And instead of forcibly feeding women who are on hunger strike, they have a new plan, which is that they imprison women, the women hunger strike. They let them out temporarily just so that they can get healthy again. And then they re-imprison them. And then they hunger strike, and the whole thing starts again.
In 1 year alone, over 100 women were arrested, and dozens of suffragettes were repeatedly force-fed, including Emmeline Pankhurst.
Mrs. Pankhurst had gone to prison so much and had gone on hunger strike so much, her health is failing. The last time she was released from a hunger strike, people didn't even recognize her.
When women are being violent themselves, and they're smashing windows or destroying private property, even destroying government property, that I think makes a lot of the public less sympathetic. But when they're being forcibly fed, that makes people sympathetic to them and angry at the government, because after all, they may be revolutionaries, but everyone in early 20th century Britain is operating in a world where most people believe that women should be protected, that it is men's job to protect women, that it is the government's job to protect women. And here exactly the opposite is happening. The government is being violent. The women need protection from the government and from these men.
Extreme militancy was captured on film at its most dramatic moment in June of 1913. At a horse race attended by the royal family, a colleague of the Pankhursts, Emily Davidson, committed the ultimate sacrifice.
She went to the great Derby Day, the great horse race in England, the royal family there, and anyone was there at the Derby. And as the king's horse was coming around, she threw herself off the railing, yelling, "Votes for women," and fell in front of a horse and was trampled to death. Her funeral became a major demonstration for women's right to vote, as women all across England came in and marched in this funeral.
Emily Davidson's horrifying and tragic death gave the suffrage movement its first and only martyr. And the Pankhursts and suffrage were back in the papers and newsreels. But while the cause was united in grief, few were aware that Emmeline, Christabel, and Sylvia had reached a personal breaking point. Emmeline and Christabel felt that Sylvia's efforts to extend their sex war into a class war undermined their goal of women's suffrage.
They're trying to appeal to elite women, more middle-class and upper-class women, and the presence of working-class women in their ranks is something that they believe is going to prevent them from doing that.
And Sylvia is kind of left behind because she maintains that commitment to working class women, to getting them involved in the fight for the vote. She really does think that economics is important, whereas more and more, Christabel and Emmeline reject that. They said that the only important class is sex.
Emmeline and Christabel delivered an ultimatum. Sylvia could either toe the line or sever all connections with the WSPU. Sylvia broke with her mother and sister and founded her own organization dedicated to the concerns of working women.
She starts her own suffrage society in the East End of London, the East London Federation of Suffragettes. This is very working class oriented and also has a pronounced socialist tinge.
But in 1914, just as suffrage had once again attained center stage in the nation's consciousness, the entire country was thrown into chaos. Britain entered World War I, and with their fate hanging in the balance, nearly every British citizen rallied behind the war effort. David Lloyd George, Britain's Prime Minister, turned to one of the most visible women in England for help. He asked Emmeline Pankhurst to spearhead the effort to get women to take jobs in the nation's factories and hospitals.
The Pankhursts turn everything to the war effort, and they may well think that by doing so, they will get the vote when the war is over. But I don't think that was their prime reasoning. I think they were caught up in this like every other Briton, if you will, that this was the greater cause for them.
World War I is kind of a giant ceasefire for all kinds of domestic conflicts in Britain. It's not just suffrage. And the people who have been protesting get a lot of public praise. They get points for putting their differences aside to be patriots.
With most of the country's young men off fighting the war, women provided the workforce that kept England's army supplied and its factories running. Their tireless efforts proved to many that women were valuable citizens. Recognizing that women's roles had changed and fearing a return to militancy, towards the end of the war, the government decided to support a bill for women's suffrage. The Equal Representation of the People Bill passed in 1918. Women were given the right to vote.
I think the truest thing we can say is that World War I changes everything. It really brings Great Britain and maybe the world into the 20th century. And so when the dust of World War I settles, it's a different country.
When you say, why did women get the vote and what did the war do? I think there are a number of things. One thing is that women really did their part during the war. I think also you cannot deny that long, long struggle for the vote, and that starts paying off. And then I think also there's the political reason, well, if the vote's coming, our party might as well get credit for it.
But there were limitations. The government only gave the vote to women over the age of 30.
With all these men dead, the numbers of women voters would swamp the male vote. The women under 30 were the women who worked in the munitions factories and had in fact contributed so much to the war effort. So it wasn't about giving women the vote because they'd helped in the war. Those people actually didn't get the vote. This was about men not being swamped by women's votes.
Over the next 10 years, suffragists and the National Union continued the campaign for equal citizenship. They pressed the government for full voting rights, and women over 30, voting for the first time, elected the first woman to Parliament. But the Pankhursts faded from the limelight. Their WSPU had been disbanded, and their one-time radical feminism had become old-fashioned in the eyes of the new women of the 1920s. Finally, in 1928, after more than 30 years of struggle, the government extended the suffrage to include all adult women.
The suffragettes, in the public mind at any rate, have gotten the credit for the success of votes for women. They also have been viewed publicly as this group of strange, radical creatures out of step with most women of their time. Creatures apart, if you will, from the rest of society.
But by rejecting the expected norm, many suffragettes made enormous personal sacrifices. The Pankhursts were no exception. Emmeline's health was severely compromised from her repeated arrests and imprisonment, and she and Christabel never reconciled with Sylvia. Emmeline Pankhurst died in 1928, only 2 months after all British women were granted the vote. In 1930, ironically, the British government unveiled a statue of Emmeline Pankhurst near the Houses of Parliament, honoring her for her commitment to equality and social justice.
I think most people assume that history is progress, that things are always getting better and better, and things are always getting more and more democratic, and things are always getting more and more fair. And so, yes, these women pointed out this injustice. But surely, England is a progressive country that makes progressive choices. Surely that would have happened anyway. And that's really not true. It happened because these women worked for it, because they devoted their lives to it. Women get the vote because they stand up and not just ask for it, but demand it.
All things are quite silent, each mortal